Shalom. This is Rabbi Maurice Sklar, and I'm coming on a little bit earlier than the 6 o'clock time because I wanted to just do first a reading hour or so, and just before and then we'll start we'll start the communion in the second part of the evening. And it is kind of, I felt like I was going kind of late for some of you, especially on the East Coast, and so at least I'm going to try to. I don't know how it's growing. Things are growing, and anyway, so I just wanted to just let you know I'm here and starting a little early, so you'll probably get a notification. Oh my, people are coming on already. So, well, very good. This isn't the official start of the service, but I wanted to keep reading in my testimony book, and once I get to preaching, it's hard for me to get back. So, and the Lord wants me to give my testimony to you, and this is a book that I wrote in the last half of the 90s. 96 I started, and then I published it in 1998. I would write it different now, maybe, but it's a very honest account of my life, and I don't have this in, I have some copies here, just the physical. I still have quite a few, but we overcome through the word of our testimony what Yeshua did for me, so we're up to chapter 3, and so I'm just going to continue. This is just my early life and how God came and found me. I didn't know him, but he knew me. Hallelujah. So I'm just going to start now, and yes, I see some of you, Joanne, and others that are coming on, and I will greet many of you, and when we start the Beit Rafa and the communion, and I want to do that. But I just wanted to do some reading and just tell you my story, because I couldn't tell it as well as this if I tried, off the cuff. So anyway, this is chapter 3, the afternoon that changed my life. One day, at a musical gathering, my dad met a young lady named Deanna Lewis. She played the violin in the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. She was very attractive, with beautiful long brown hair, brown eyes, a slender figure, and a sweet smile. With her outgoing, vivacious personality and her love and devotion to music, it was not hard to see why Dad would be attracted to her. She could talk your ear off about many things, but it all seemed so interesting. Dad and Deanna shared so much together. Deanna liked Dad because he was a successful attorney who also shared her love of the music world without threatening her with his ability on the cello. He understood and respected her as a professional musician, but most of all, he was amazed at how she and I hit it off so well together. I believe she had been given a special love for me from the Lord, and she treated me as if I were her own son. I was probably about 4 years old at this time. I enjoyed all this new attention, of course, and she actually began to minister to my heart in the area of abandonment and rejection that had come as a result of losing my mother, Audrey, or when my dad divorced. Just like a flower begins to flourish and blossom with the warmth of the sunlight, the proper soil and watering, I began to respond to Deanna's love and warmth toward me. In fact, the next 4 years of my life were to be the best of my whole young life. Out of those years came much of the formation of who I am as a musician and a person today. After a brief courtship, Dad asked Deanna to marry him, and she said yes. They became engaged, and a new mommy came into my life. Deanna attended a Unitarian church in Atlanta. Dad and I started to go to this church with her, and I became a project, quote unquote, of sorts to Deanna. This was the late 60s, around 1967, and an optimistic time for what was called progressive education. We see the terrible fruits of that today in every night on the news. But this was a different, the world was trying desperately to divorce itself from anything traditional as far as God and morality were concerned, especially concerning the Bible. After his experiences with tragedy and the seeming failure of God and religion to help him at all, my dad eagerly embraced this watered-down, secular, humanistic religion. After all, it was respectable, even, quote, artistic, with a capital A. I was tolerant of any religion. In fact, you could believe anything and still be accepted. They would say, there are many paths to God and man is basically good. We just need the right environment, the right education, and the absence of anything considered oppressive and inhibiting. And man can solve his problems on his own. Such was the message of the Unitarian Universalists in the 1960s. My introduction to music and the arts. Music and the arts became our gods, our family. We worshiped and bowed down to the music world, its artists, its concerts, and its creations. There was a clear hierarchy of people within this world. The local Atlanta musicians and artists, such as those in the Atlanta Symphony, were not really admired much by Deanna and Dad. They weren't as holy and exalted as the visiting artists and soloists from New York and Europe who came to Atlanta to perform with them. These people were the giants among all the gods of the music world. Granted, this was a small and elite world where only a few could enter, and only if they had enough talent. My parents believed they knew and could judge accurately who had or didn't have this exalted status. So our lives revolved around the culture of the performing arts world. It was the hub of our family fellowship, if you will, and conversation for a number of years. As a 4-year-old boy, I had very little understanding of all this, but I could pick up very quickly what was important and what meant the most to Dad and Deanna. I was very good at adapting to what they wanted me to be, so it wasn't hard for me to adopt their tastes and standards as my own. They took me out to the finest restaurants. They dressed me up and took me to the symphony, the ballet, and the opera. We went to museums and saw fine paintings and sculptures at art galleries and openings. We read books and listened to fine musical recordings. I was introduced to the visiting soloists who performed with the symphony. I was invited to receptions after concerts to be with all those people who were the underpinnings of the fine arts community in Atlanta. You know, I was kind of I'd freak adults out even then, because I was basically, I could talk to you about the way I do now. I was one of these, kind of strange kids that are not children, or not. I was, but I would freak everybody out, and I got attention that way, and so it reinforced it, and not such a great idea. But anyway, the wedding. Dad and Deanna's wedding was a very confusing experience for me. I remember sitting in the circular sanctuary of the Unitarian Church in Atlanta, Georgia, watching my dad get married. I remember wondering why I was watching his wedding when I wasn't supposed to be born yet. It didn't fit into the scheme of things. I belonged and yet I didn't belong. Deanna was my, quote, mom, unquote, and yet she wasn't. I felt like I was losing Dad to this new woman in our lives. No longer would Dad need me as his best friend. Now I was just a part of his life along with this lady who had worked her way into our lives. According to the Unitarian minister, the, quote, inner light was witnessing this holy marriage ceremony as Dad and Deanna were joined into conjugal bliss amid the candles and all the religious trappings that could be allowed in this progressive, late 60s, secular but elegant mess of a wedding. Well, it was, unfortunately, the inner light of which the minister spoke wasn't enough to keep Dad and Deanna's marriage or home from falling apart later on. But the service was certainly beautiful and unique. Deanna had some of her symphony friends perform a particular slow movement from a late Beethoven string quartet. For her, this represented the holiest thing she could think of. It is very beautiful, that particular movement. Dad was so taken with her that it didn't matter to him what kind of wedding it was. After the failure of 2 Jewish marriages, he wasn't even sure there was a God anymore. He loved her, and that was enough of a religion for him. He was happy to enter into her world, since his was so dark and lonely. I knew somehow that this new family would be a good thing for Dad and me. At least we weren't alone in this wretched world any longer. I also knew we would be happier with Deanna, and we were a pretty happy family for the next several years. I am thankful for those years and all that the Lord put into my life through my dad and Deanna, for they would be the only real dad and mom I would ever know, of course. A special present, one afternoon, an event happened that would change my life. Deanna came home with a little violin case under her arm. She said to me, "I have a special present for you, Maury." I watched as she placed a little 1/8 size violin case on the sofa. "What is it?" I asked. "It's a violin," she told me. "Come over here. Let's see if you can play it. You have such marvelous fingers for the violin and such a fine ear for music that I went and bought this violin for you." I ran over to the sofa and looked at it. I felt very excited, but I didn't know why. Maybe I could play this beautiful, strange instrument. "Do you want to try it, Maury?" Deanna asked me. I picked it up very carefully, and she put it under my chin. Deanna had taught strings and music in the public schools in Raleigh, North Carolina, before moving to Atlanta to join the symphony, so she knew how to introduce the violin to me. She showed me how to hold it. I thought it was horribly awkward, and it hurt to twist my left hand all the way around the fingerboard. It hurt my fingers even more when I placed them on the strings. It was really painful to play the violin. But as I held the bow for the first time and finally managed to bring it across the strings, something clicked on the inside of me, and I was able to draw a nice sound out of the open strings. I seemed to have a knack for being able to do whatever Deanna said to do with the violin. But it hurt so much to be in this awkward position that I soon stopped. Now, the reason why I remembered this so clearly is I actually went back and saw it in a vision. I mean, God gave the whole book to me that way. I heard and saw the conversation, and the Holy Spirit helped me write the book, and He just would touch different memories, and so this just came back, and so I wrote all of this out of this ongoing, like the different things that the Lord just caused me to recall, and I saw my whole life in a vision, and that's why I wrote it. Then that special presence filled the room. I now know it was the same presence that Nanny Beulah brought when she would sing the spirituals to me. And as I talked about in the last time in chapter 2 there, but I actually didn't include that in the book, so you got something fresh there about her. because that came no more than 15 years ago or so, when the Lord reminded me. When I asked, I said, "Who in the world witnessed to me?" Well, it was this blanket of love, this blanket of it was the presence of the Holy Spirit. I felt it immediately, but I didn't know what it was. Deanna felt it too. She said to me, as she did so many times after that, "Maury, you are a very special and gifted child, and I think you have a great gift in music." I didn't know what to make of the violin, except it sure hurt a lot to play it. When Dad got home later that day, Deanna took the new violin out and showed it to him. He inspected it and asked about its price and quality. He seemed satisfied when Deanna told him where she had bought it, how much it had cost, and who had made it. It was a nice instrument, even by his standards. Then the torturous thing was again placed under my chin. Dad insisted that I be taught how to play the violin properly from the very first. So Deanna put me into all kinds of contortions until I was finally in the right position. That's what it felt like, After getting the fingers of my right hand in the proper position, I once again began to draw the bow across the strings, while Deanna moved the fingers of my left hand around to play a few notes. It hurt so much that I started crying, but I passed that first inspection and lesson. After a few minutes, I threw a temper tantrum because it hurt so much and I wanted to stop. I was feeling both excitement and pain at the same time. Well, that's the story of the violin in my life right there. Why was Dad so demanding, I wondered. I just wanted to try the violin again, and he was already seeing how far I could go. Did I manage to do some things that really impressed? I did manage to do some things that really impressed him, though. For the next few days, all he could talk about was how talented I was on the violin. And not many lessons and weeks after, Dad and Deanna, about 3 weeks later, Dad and Deanna decided that I was going to be a world-class violinist when I grew up. They were amazed because I caught on to the instrument so easily, and they thought I played so, quote, musically and expressively. How can you do that as a beginner? I don't know. I don't think anyway. And always, whenever I played, that unusual presence would come and fall on us like a blanket. After that, about 3 or 4 weeks, I became a holy cause for the Sklar family, who determined to help me become a fine violinist. My, quote, giftedness even advanced me a little bit onto the sacred ground of my parents' worship of artists. I relished the attention, but resented much of the expectations placed upon me. Dad was determined that I must have the proper training and all the things that he never had as a cellist. For Deanna, I was a shining example of what the proper environment and education could do for children. I was especially a demonstration of how successful she was in teaching a, quote, gifted, unquote, child, for I could do whatever she and Dad wanted me to do. So began my career as a violinist. By far, this period of my life as a young boy was the most profound in shaping my future years. It was a positive and, for the most part, happy time for me. Chapter 4 is Lessons with Dad and Deanna. The next few years were fairly happy ones. We bought a house on Channing Drive, and my time there was the best of any. There was a new stability in my life, and I was able to put behind me the tragic loss of my mother and other traumatic events that had affected me, even at that age. Perhaps things will really be better now for me, I thought. If I can play the violin well enough, I will really belong in this new family, and they will love and accept me. We will have a good life together. I loved to go play in the park that was adjacent to our house. One day, I was walking in the park down near the creek when suddenly I felt a familiar someone with me. I couldn't see him and didn't know who he was, but ever so often I would sense his presence. He would talk to me and tell me wonderful things about his love for me. He even answered any questions I had running through my 5-year-old brain. This time he came and walked along beside me. He told me that I had something very special to do in my life and that he would always be with me. He said he would always be a friend, that I could count on him no matter what. I thought it was kind of strange to hear this from someone I couldn't see. But I was glad to have this friend anyway, and I told him so. He said he was glad I wanted him in my life because many people didn't want him and turned him away. I asked, why? You're so nice that anyone who met you would want you as their friend, wouldn't they? He told me that many people liked other friends more than him. He was sad when he said that, but I told him I knew what he meant because sometimes people didn't like me either. He said he knew that, which is why he wanted me as his friend always. My interactions with my invisible friend touched me deep within my being, even as a 5-year-old. I didn't understand them, but I needed to talk about them. Somehow I figured this must be God who was talking to me, so I began to ask my parents questions about God. I didn't tell them about my conversations with him because I knew they wouldn't approve of them. Learning about the gods. When I wouldn't stop talking about God, Dad and Deanna decided that they needed to do something about my inquisitiveness. So Deanna decided she would read me a book she found from the Unitarian Church. I still remember what the cover of this book looked like. It was a light beige with red letters that said, "Finding God in All the Religions of the World." It was written for inquisitive kids like me who wanted to find out what God was like. Deanna read me a chapter one night before bed, and Dad read me one the next. I learned about all the different names and kinds of gods there are in the world. Of course, not all of them, but the major ones. I learned about Buddha and who he was, and I learned about the millions of Hindu gods. After mentioning every religion that the authors could think of, they finally put in a chapter about Jesus. According to them, he was a spineless, weak, pansy-type man who walked around talking about flowers and birds and saying, "Love, love, love," all the time. But he was a very good moral teacher and a good man, the book said. He taught people to be nice and sweet to each other in this milquetoast way. Then people came along after he died and made another god out of him. The book also had an opinion about the Jewish religion as the mean God of the Bible. It said he kills, murders, and sentences people to hell even when they don't know they are bad. The rest of the religion seemed nice and sweet, but the Bible was a bad book that told about a mean God who couldn't be trusted. He was obviously the worst God because he said we were all sinners and were going to hell, while the truth is we are all good people and there's no such thing as hell. That's what this book revealed. The author said hell was a superstitious belief of people hundreds of years ago before we learned the truth about the universe through science. They stated that all people everywhere are good no matter what they believe. Everyone is right and nobody's wrong. All we need in life is to help each other and to make the right choices, and then we will live in heaven right here on this earth. We don't need to wait for anything when we die. It is right now, this life, that matters because that's all there is to existence anyway. When you die, that's it. It's all over. This was what the authors of that book said. My parents told me I could choose whichever God I wanted, or I could invent my own if I thought that was better. According to them, there were no bad choices except maybe the God in the Bible, but it was my choice. However, they told me that religion is for people who need help coping with life, people who need a crutch to help them get through. They told me it was only for weak and dumb people, not for the culturally elite people like me and my family. They assured me that I had a lot of talent and a great intellect, and I would be a great violinist and a very smart person when I grew up, so I really didn't need religion. After several months of hearing this, my hunger for God was quenched almost entirely. I soon forgot about this friend who came to me at times in a special way. My parents told me I had just an overactive imagination. Since I was able to learn new things quickly and was doing well on the violin, I determined that the gods of music and the violin would be my gods too, just as they were for my parents. After all, my parents loved me best when I was playing the violin well. Sad to say, I did not hear much from my friend for quite a long time after that. My parents placed great value on education, particularly on my musical training. I am thankful in many ways for the constant nudging and guidance they gave me growing up. Without their faith and relentless resolve to make me into a concert violinist, I most certainly would have become something else. Probably, or I probably would have. They were extremely determined about my musical training, and the seeds of their ambition eventually grew into the musician I am today. My parents were set on me being a fine musician and violinist. For Dad, it was a deeply personal agenda. Of course, this is years later when I actually went through a whole lot of therapy as a young man in my early 20s, and I learned a lot about what happened. And, so some of this may be analysis or something from any, but again, I would write this book differently. This was a cathartic book for me. I had just gotten into some sort of relationship again with my dad. And so it was, the Lord gave it to me. And this anyway, so I'll just keep reading. I'm determined not to preach right now. I just want to read. I hope that's okay with you. For Dad, it was a deeply personal agenda. My success would prove that he wasn't a failure as a musician. I would be what he never was. I had, quote, the goods, unquote. I was the proverbial goose that laid the golden eggs of musical talent. That was the negative side. The positive side was that he really was proud of me when I played well, and I delighted in that approval. He would light up like a Christmas tree when I would meet with his goals in our practice sessions and in family performances for his friends. Unfortunately, to please him in that way wasn't easy. Even after I had jumped through whatever hoops he had put in front of me during practice, Dad never remained satisfied for very long. Once I could do what had been impossible for me to do 2 days earlier, my accomplishment was forgotten and the new hoops were presented for me to jump through. That is not a fun way for any kid to grow up. However, I am thankful for the challenges that were placed before me. Without them, I would not have been able to master the violin as I did. I believe the Lord placed me in the family he did precisely because he knew that my talent would be developed in that way. The Lord causes all things to work together for our good when we turn toward his grace through our prayers and intercession, Romans 8:28. God's grace was on me in spite of the emotional trauma I was subjected to during my childhood. I thank God for whoever prayed for me in my young life, including Nanny Beulah, who had prayed for me, took care of me in the years right before my dad married Deanna. More training in music and the arts. At first, it was a real blessing for Deanna to teach me academics and the violin. She recognized that God had given me special gifts, and she had a genuine desire to see me rise up and conquer things at a young age that others couldn't do. She really did love and care for me, but she also wanted me to succeed for two other reasons. Deanna knew that Dad was so bent on my doing well in life, and particularly on the violin, that he would not be happy unless I did, and she wanted to make him happy. Second, she wanted to prove what she could do with someone like me to teach. I gave her a purpose, a great quest in which she could prove what could be done with the right environment, the right education, and a great talent. Deanna believed it would all mix together into a fantastic stew, and she could be the cook. Of course, I only recognize this now. It was not something I understood growing up. All I knew was that I got a lot of attention and praise by doing what others wanted me to do. My life went much more smoothly when I was able to score another point on my parents' list of projected accomplishments. This included a lot of academic stuff, reading. I studied French. I studied. They actually thought the faster I could learn it, the better, because then I'd be ahead. See, then you understand, of course. Of course, I knew that they really wanted the best for me, and that was the way they showed their love. When I started my lessons with Dad, he just taught me on open strings on the violin instead of having me play music. This was so I would learn to use my bow arm perfectly. He had me do exercises to work on my bow changes to make them so smooth that they would be imperceptible. He wanted me to be able to control my bow at any position and at any speed. To this day, one of the strongest aspects of my playing is my right hand and bow control. Dad's favorite phrases were, "Do it again," "Bend your thumb," "Parallel to the bridge," "Don't go around the corner at the tip of the bow," "Straight bow," "Smooth bow changes." When I lapsed at all in my concentration, he would say, "Turn your brain on," and "I'll stay here till midnight if I have to, until you do it right." Deanna quickly realized that she would not be the one to teach me the violin. Dad completely took over and only once in a while asked advice from her. I was a daily project with him. It was rare that I did not end my violin practice and lesson in tears and with tremendous frustration, anger. I often went into a rage and argued with him. Eventually, a problem began to emerge between Deanna and Dad. I took so much of his focus and attention that she began to feel neglected. It was always Maury this and Maury that. Finally, after a year of these intense lessons, I could play pretty well, even with my bow, and I could even do some virtuoso bowing, such as a 4-string ricochet, spiccato, and others. It almost made me angry that I could do it, but somehow, in spite of my stubborn resistance toward my dad, I learned it anyway. Then I was ready to start playing with my left hand. Once again, I had to put my fingers down onto the strings, onto the fingerboard. I hadn't liked doing it the first time I had picked up the instrument. I didn't like it any better this time. It still hurt. I complained pretty loudly about it, but that just caused another argument. I was tired of it all, so after about a year of lessons, I refused to play my violin anymore. I quit. I could not endure it any longer. After I had made a decision to quit playing violin, the strife level in our house decreased considerably. Deanna wasn't as threatened with my talent or my pull on Dad's time, energy, and devotion. He could spend more time with things other than perfecting me on the violin. Meanwhile, Dad and Deanna taught me other things like reading with flashcards, mathematics, chess, geography, history, and of course, humanism. I grew up on educational TV. I learned that we evolved from primates over millions and billions of years from Bronowski's book, The Ascent of Man, and also I had to actually recite the different early man, Cro-Magnon, and then there was Neanderthal and whatever, all those. But we read beautiful illustrated books on great artists, which I liked, such as Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Van Gogh, and Monet. My parents read me books on many different subjects, including science, poetry, and literary masterpieces. I was to have the best of everything in every realm and in every way. Nothing could be drab or mediocre. Then, if I failed in life, my parents would know it wasn't their fault. After all, what other child had been given as much as Maury? They were determined to be 5-star parents, first class, all the way. A new addition to our family and a move. One day, Deanna came home from her orchestra rehearsal, beaming from ear to ear. She looked like she was floating. She said, "Maury, I'm going to have a baby." I just went to the doctor, and he said that a little baby is in my tummy. You're going to have a little sister, a little brother. Isn't that exciting? I was very excited and a little confused over this news. When Dad got home from work, we all threw a party and got very happy about a new child coming to our home. Very soon, however, the dynamics of our family began to change. As Deanna began to grow larger and larger around the middle, and the spring season was drawing to a close, she knew that she would have to take a leave of absence from the orchestra to have the baby. She was also having strong maternal and hormonal reactions that were redirecting her motivation away from concert life. She longed to stay at home, be a mommy, and raise her baby. Even though the new baby wasn't fully on the scene yet, her presence was keenly felt. Things normally change when a new baby comes, and all the preparation for Deanna's own child, slowly but surely, I became secondary to the main attraction. Of course, that naturally happens to any firstborn child when a new brother or sister comes, but my situation was magnified considerably by several unique features. First of all, Deanna was obsessed with being a perfect mother. If she would give me so much, then her own flesh and blood would have even more. She had all kinds of new security needs, and Dad's preoccupation with me was threatening to her. Dad had an authoritarian hold over me, but I also had a kind of control over him. He would always be at my beck and call if I behaved in certain ways. I was a master at pushing his buttons, which I am ashamed of today. I could get his attention whenever I wanted, even if it was of a negative nature. I was also threatened by this new baby. Would my life be altered yet again? You say, well, how can a 5-year-old think that? 6-year-old, I don't know. I did. I don't know. I was a strange boy. Would my life be altered yet again? Would Deanna stop wanting me now that she had her own baby? Many such thoughts rolled around in my subconscious mind. Actually, Deanna was determined to not favor the new baby over me. It did not fit into her motherly agenda to be so base as to fall into such a blatant trap. No, indeed. She would prove all the child psychologists and family therapists wrong. She was enlightened and could raise us both in utopia and endless familial bliss. She was reading I'm Okay, You're Okay, and those kind of books. As I mentioned earlier, I had quit the violin out of sheer frustration, but it had left a pretty major gap in my life. I had been demoted several levels in my parents' estimation. The violin had been my trump card. That was before Donald was around. So I just said trump card. Bridge. Yeah. It had gotten me loads of attention, especially from Dad, and had made me much more lovable and important to them. At times I had even ascended into the throne room of the evolutionary elite. I had that magic touch, and when I had played, the music flowed from my violin, even in a beginner level, in a beautiful way, even on exercises with open strings. My parents had oohed and ahed, looked at each other with that expert knowing look, and raised their eyebrows as I jumped through more of their hoops. But all that was over for me. Playing the violin simply wasn't worth it. The reaction I got from my parents didn't satisfy me. After all, I had my parents' attention anyway. I had a fairly happy home life now, and Deanna had made our house into a home, and I enjoyed school. For now, it was as good as it ever would be. They surely didn't love me just for my violin talent, did they? That turned out to be the biggest question in my life. However, the stormy waters were approaching. Even then, things were not as secure as they had once been. There were mild disagreements between my parents almost every day, and ever so often Dad and Deanna had screaming arguments with each other. That was unsettling enough, but it was even more unsettling that I was no longer the center of Deanna's affections. No matter how hard she tried to conceal it, I knew that the new baby was far more important to her. When my sister Gloria was born, I adored her, but I knew that if I didn't do all I could to show Deanna that I was totally comfortable with her, she would feel bad. Then things ultimately would turn out for the worst. One day, Dad found out about an opportunity to be the personnel manager of an orchestra in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He thought about it and finally decided that he wasn't happy with law and accounting work anymore. Maybe this was just the thing he needed. He could have a career in music even if it was on a much smaller scale. He could play in the orchestra and be a big fish in a little pond, and he could work in the administration for the symphony. Besides, it cost a lot less to live in Iowa than in Atlanta. He could leave the 9-to-5 grind and with the daily traffic jams and be involved in music. He could also be at home more with his family. Perhaps the change would be good for Deanna too. Tensions were mounting, and Deanna wasn't as happy as she used to be. Maybe the professional world was too much for her. My dad would talk to me about all this. That's why I know he would. I was sort of I became the counselor between them. She could be more of an at-home mom in Iowa. She could also play in the symphony, since the concert schedule wasn't nearly as intense as that of a major orchestra like Atlanta. Well, that's an understatement. Dad and Deanna were now the parents of 2 kids. They should be raised in a nice community, etc., etc. So went the thoughts of Charles Sklar. And like I said, I was a sounding board, so I heard them all. He went to Cedar Rapids, interviewed for the job, and was accepted. They liked the added bonus of Deanna playing in the orchestra, I'm sure. So less than 8 weeks after Gloria was born, we sold our house, and packed all our belongings into a big U-Haul truck, and set out for Iowa. Little Gloria was nursing at Deanna's breast, and Dad drove as we made our way into the great Midwest. Talk about a sudden and drastic change. This was 1970. I have moved and changed my life so many times that it is a good thing the Lord gave me a disposition for it. Otherwise, I would have been miserable. Every year or so from this time on, I lived somewhere different, or went to another school, or lived with a different family. Life was pretty unpredictable, but I seemed to have a joy that drowned it out. It didn't matter. I seemed to enjoy it. I didn't have much stability in my young life as a result of all the change, but at least it brought some added fun and adventure. At least my life was not dull and boring. No, it wasn't that. So I'm going to read a little bit more, maybe one. So this is chapter 5, Dad's Growing Obsession. I turned 7 in June of 1970, and as we arrived in Iowa and entered a new phase, I didn't feel so helpless against the negative forces that seemed to swallow up my earlier life. In spite of the arguments and difficulties that were beginning to emerge in my parents' relationship, I was happier now. The nightmare of the abandonment and the collapse of Dad's first marriage were beginning to fade into the past. I was also relieved to be away from the strain of the music world and its pull on my parents. There was nowhere near the same level of pressure on Deanna, and she could be at home more with us. The Cedar Rapids Symphony was just a small regional orchestra with a limited schedule, so she wasn't having to play in a concert every week of the year as she had in Atlanta. I felt like we could be normal people, whatever that is. We were doing our best to adapt and fit into the mindset of Midwestern, small-town, rural America. Several months into my second grade year, I asked Deanna if I could play the violin again. I said that if I could study with someone else other than Dad, I would like to try to play again. I told them that I was very sorry that I had a bad attitude before, but that I would like to try again if there was someone who could teach me. They jumped on that, of course, and immediately found a man named Jack Ranney, who taught strings in the public schools in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and played also in the symphony. He seemed nice and patient to my parents, and so I began taking private lessons with him. Playing the violin again. It had been a little over a year since I had quit playing the violin, but it all came back to me very quickly. I had grown quite a bit and was much stronger now, so the left-hand fingers didn't hurt when I placed them on the strings. Mr. Ranney was very nice and patient indeed. He started me on a high school level beginning violin method book. I remember Applebaum, Samuel Applebaum can't remember the title. I learned to read music from flashcards in Atlanta, so I didn't have any problem reading the music in the book. I learned things so quickly that Mr. Ranney was quite amazed. He had never had a student who could do what he wanted with as much ease as I could. He always complimented my lessons and said, "Maury, you're such a natural on the violin. You're going to go far in music if you keep it up." He was very nice. I practiced in the afternoons down in the basement with only an occasional intrusion from Dad when he couldn't stand it anymore and had to give me a few pointers. Whenever I practiced in the house, I could literally feel the ears of both Dad and Deanna monitoring my every note. It wasn't easy, but they really tried to stay out of my practice time. I had demanded that if I played the violin again, they were not to interfere with me. I was going to do it myself. For a time, they did admirably in giving me enough leeway so that I could do it more on my own. Soon, however, Dad felt that he just had to get involved again. He felt morally obligated to train me hard on the violin because I had what he considered to be the kind of talent that only a few people in the world have ever been given. He told me that if I had had only a little ability on the violin, he wouldn't have interfered. He would have just let me enjoy piddling with the violin. But after only a few weeks of leaving me alone, he started working with me again because, as he said, he didn't want me to learn bad habits. So we were at it again. This time, however, it was better because he backed down if I got too upset during his lessons. Deanna also argued with him and told him not to go overboard. At those times, he would back down a little bit, and I would have a few days' respite before the next onslaught began. However, I'm thankful now for what God put into my father to help me and train me, though at the time I didn't like it. I continued to play my little songs perfectly for Mr. Ranney, and he was very pleased. Dad did another thing that really set the course of my life. He always spoke a word of faith over me. He always spoke faith over me. He told me that when I grew up, I would become a great violinist. I would do what he had always dreamed of doing and, quote, make it as a soloist in the music world. I just had to practice very hard and it would surely happen. Deanna was beginning to get really upset at Dad again because of his obsession with me and the violin. He would have these long conversations with me and describe the glories of the music world that I was, quote, heir apparent. Heir apparent to. When I was a little older, Deanna often said to my dad in derision and heavy sarcasm, "What do you think that Maury is anyway? God's gift to the violin? Leave him alone and let him be a normal boy. You don't want him to become a totally warped person, do you?" She had my best interest at heart, but I think she also became jealous of me because I had such a hold on Dad. The first thing he asked her when he walked in the door each night after work was, "Did Maury do his practicing today? How much did he do?" So Deanna had a genuine concern for me because of Dad's obsession concerning my music, and more she felt like she had second place. Dad's world always revolved around me and the violin. This created problems for her and aggravated the already strained relationship between all of us. Deanna's reaction was to build a strong relationship with Gloria and to favor her over me. This added to the sibling rivalry that had already developed between us, even though Gloria had just begun to walk. As time went on, Deanna felt she had been robbed of her career with a major orchestra. There was so little for her musically in Iowa, and she began to develop a festering resentment toward Dad because of this. It did not surface until later, but the seeds were being planted at that time. I was really oblivious to all of this except the strife in our home, which at times was quite high, most of the time, between my parents. It was a mistake to go to Iowa, for sure, and certainly in the natural, but God used it. Making memories. Nevertheless, there was still much that was warm and pleasant about our home life in Cedar Rapids. Dad took me out to a lake that had frozen over and taught me how to ice skate. After a few falls and some awkward and wobbly attempts, I got to where I could skate fairly well. I loved the winter activities there in Iowa that I was able to participate in, such as tobogganing and sledding, ice skating, and even snowshoeing, which I was introduced to. During that winter, there were several big snowstorms, and it was great to be able to stay home from school and play in the snow with the other kids in the neighborhood. I remember we had a very big and steep hill at the end of our street. Red Fox Road dropped severely at the other end, creating quite a daredevil hill to sled and toboggan down after it iced over and snowed. I remember nearly getting killed going down that hill. We probably approached speeds of 70 miles an hour or more as we plummeted to the bottom. These were the days when you go out and play. Remember that? I just played with the kids in the neighborhood. I got scared once when I nearly lost control, and I only tried it once or twice after that, but it was sure a whole lot of fun. I received several letters from Audrey, my real mother, during my time in Iowa. Since I could read them, she addressed them directly to me. She had moved to Germany after marrying a man named Art Hilly, who was stationed there in the military. She seemed like a very far away person. Her letters made me uncomfortable, and I wasn't encouraged by either of my parents to pursue much of a relationship with her. Dad never talked about her except in negative terms of how she had abandoned me, so I did not think very highly of her. But her letters had a sincere ring to them. She said she felt so guilty and was very sorry for not being there for me. She had a new baby boy named Louis, who was supposed to be my brother, or he was, and she wondered if we could keep in touch. She asked that I could please write back to her because she really missed me. I couldn't help thinking that if she missed me so much, why wouldn't she come and see me? It really didn't make a whole lot of sense. I tried to write back to her out of duty, but I never really enjoyed it, so I wrote her very little. Deanna had become my mother now, even with all her faults and her favoritism of Gloria. I had accepted her as my mother. She really did treat me well most of the time. Gloria was so cute when she was learning to walk and then toddling around with her curly blonde hair and her sweet giggles. I loved playing with her inside the house during the long winter hours. I thank God for the memories of our family at that time. I had a reasonably normal life for the next couple of years, playing with my precious baby sister and enjoying some of the benefits of Iowa family life. Unfortunately, those times would quickly pass into memory as my life started to take on the great quest of fulfilling my dad's dreams and the Lord's plans as well during the coming years. But just prior to that time, life had been as secure as it would ever be for me, even through many successes and triumphs that were up ahead. That was the foundation that held me up through the first 22 years of my life. I thank God for what he did for me and for all the good that was a part of my parents' attempts at raising me without the Lord. By his grace, God made up much of what I needed. Praise his holy name. Things weren't going so well for Dad at the Cedar Rapids Symphony Orchestra. For whatever reason, they were not happy with him and the job he was doing. He didn't seem to fit in with the hometown laid-back Midwestern pace of life and was probably too demanding on the musicians. I'm certain of that. Dad had a short temper and wanted everything done perfectly a while ago. He demanded it from himself, and expected everyone else to do likewise. They wanted an easygoing farmer type who would just go with the flow. He was so frustrated with them that he would come home and be ready to tear his hair out because of their lack of confidence. The problem was, according to Dad, that they were convinced they were quite confident, thank you very much, and they didn't need his input or his suggestions. He just turned them off, so they fired him. Unfortunately, that wasn't too convenient for us. The entire summer of 1971 was pretty hard on all of us as a family. Since Dad was unemployed, he was at home all the time except when we traveled for interviews. We couldn't wait until he was working. He couldn't wait until he was working at something. And we couldn't wait. Yes, we couldn't wait until he was out of the house working at something, anything again. He was so irritable and felt really down on himself because he wasn't providing for his family. He kept saying he made a big mistake when he left Atlanta, which was true. Since I was at home all the time, Dad decided that would be a fine opportunity to teach me daily on the violin. That was the most intensive summer we ever had together. He took out his frustrations on me. He would practice with me sometimes for over 3-4 hours at a time. We would repeat passages of my music over and over until it was good enough for him. I was really excelling in my studies, but was beginning to hate and dread each day when I had to get my violin out of the case. Dad's temper was at an all-time high, and his patience was at an all-time low. His fuse was as short as I had ever seen it. He was getting more and more exasperated at failing to find a job. When he was gone, it eased up considerably, but when he returned after not finding anything, it was bad. Deanna would nag him and complain about Iowa, asking him why he had taken her away from Atlanta in her career. She was being affected by the financial pressure also, and reacted by coming down on Dad and me. So no one was more relieved than I was when the position in the law firm opened up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and we said goodbye to Iowa forever. A new start in Louisiana. Now Dad could reclaim his place in the upper middle class as a respected attorney in the community. He got a position in the law firm there. He probably was getting the best salary he had ever received. Dad had many friends from his college days at LSU, and this was a tremendous help to him in getting established. Most of the attorneys and all of the professional community operated on what he called the good old boy buddy system. Being somebody was determined by whom you knew and what family you came from, more than by how brilliant you were and how good a job you did in your profession. You had to go hunting and fishing with the right people, own a lakeside camping home on False River where you invited the who's who for crawfish boils and long weekends of water skiing, and generally hobnob in the right way with the Southern establishment. That's how the moneyed people lived and let live in the bayou land of Louisiana. Nothing turned Dad off more than this type of political stuff. Or just he didn't nevertheless, well, he didn't like sports and he didn't like outdoor stuff. Nevertheless, he was and still is so brilliant in Louisiana. Well, he's gone on to be with the Lord now. Louisiana tax law, that to this day he is one of the most respected attorneys in all of Louisiana. He is still, at the time of this writing, practicing law in Baton Rouge. He retired right after Katrina. He had a photographic memory, and he could read something and remember it. He sat down and speed read the Louisiana tax code, which is like none other. It's a huge book, and it's based on the French, the Napoleonic law, the French law, which nobody knows. But he remembered, he could just read it once and he knew, so he never lost a case because nobody knows that book. The lawyers don't know, it's impossible, and so he just didn't lose. And so, thank God the financial pressure, though, was gone, and so were the relentless and tormenting violin lessons I had endured that summer in Cedar Rapids while Dad was unemployed. Now, with him back at work, I could escape and do some other things after school and on weekends. I enjoyed riding my bike through the immense and labyrinthian subdivision that we had moved into. I would meet all kinds of people, both adults and children, during my outings. I had quite the adventures. Baton Rouge wasn't Atlanta, but it was a whole lot better for my parents. They began to return to their preferences and their convictions. They could be, quote, artists, unquote, again, and because Dad had landed such a good job, the finances were there to make us comfortable. They were now respected in the community, and that meant a great deal to them. Dad was a part of an elite law firm that had lots of perks that the position allowed him, including membership in the exclusive City Club with its Old South hospitality. By the way, there's no way that world's gone, and I'm glad. Some of the rate, I don't believe in that. I better say that. I don't want somebody coming and tearing my house apart. No, I don't believe in that. But that was 1971, back a few years ago. Deanna and Dad both had positions in the Baton Rouge Symphony Orchestra. Deanna could still play the violin well and was in the symphony and the local music community. Dad still plays in the symphony at the time of this writing and has every season since 1971. And he played also as a music student, law student, when he was at LSU as well. So he actually played in the Baton Rouge Symphony for 50 years, and then finally he retired. The Lord has blessed him with a good life in Baton Rouge. Failure formula. Since it was September and school had already begun, I was put into the public elementary school in our area. Let me tell you a formula that will guarantee failure for an 8-year-old in the public school system in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I know. I was there. First, Be an outsider coming in after school has begun. Second, don't be good in sports. Be on the weaker side and skinny physically. Third, add to that a smart alecky attitude in class as you demonstrate how much you know. Fourth, become the teacher's pet. Always add to the discussions and answer every question right, and thus make the other students look dumb and foolish. Fifth, like cherries on top of a nauseating sundae, play the violin, wear thick glasses, and be Jewish. That's it. The surefire formula for hell on earth in school. Now, I knew nothing about being Jewish at that time, and I don't want to magnify something that I was totally unaware of. But I know that it is like wearing a badge in the spirit realm saying, please do your best to persecute me. Well, I managed to get all of the appropriate negative responses that were humanly possible from one group of kids during the next 3 years. It got very familiar for me, for it had happened over and over. Why did this happen? It happened for several reasons. I was living in a family with a very warped sense of values. They considered that the more I demonstrated my, quote, precociousness, unquote, the more value I had. I was admired for my violin playing and my intellectual abilities with all Dad's and Deanna's adult friends. I was once again providing more fuel for their social ascension through my clear demonstration of his superior rearing and genetics. Dear God, it's so ridiculous. On several occasions when I arrived home, beaten up, with my clothes torn, Dad would say to me, Maury, you can't just let them do this to you. Take a brick and throw it at them and hit them in the head or something. I can't stand this turning the other cheek business. What's wrong with you? Fight back. Fight back. I don't blame them for doing that to you when you act the way you do. You deserve it. If you don't fight back, you'll be the laughing stock of the school. I guess you are that anyway. Then he had calmed down and was not so angry. When he had calmed down, was not so angry, he would say, Maury, you're different than those other kids your own age. It's not your fault. You have a special talent on the violin and you're very smart. I never fit in with my schoolmates either. When you grow up some more and can be with other musicians and artists like yourself, they will accept you and like you. Don't worry about it. You'll have the last laugh one day when you're playing violin all over the world and they're stuck in some grocery store, punching a clock and reading about you in the paper. But if you don't practice and develop, you'll be just like them. We'll see how well you do in music. If I had your talent, I could have made it in music, even though I started late. But you will have everything that I can give you. Then, if you fail, you will have nobody to blame but yourself. Stop being so talkative with those classmates of yours. Stand up like a man and fight them. If you can't do that, maybe they are right. Maybe you really are just a sissy violinist. Take a crowbar and whack one of them in the head and send them to the hospital, and they'll stop giving you trouble. It's hard to find a crowbar when you don't know what one is, much less taking it with you to school without being noticed. Besides, even if I'd had one, I would have gotten so paralyzed with fear that they could have taken it away from me and finished me off with it. So I never tried anything like that. I wasn't capable of proving my manhood by sending someone to the hospital. I was really a case. However, things were not all bad during that year. I had some good times at home with Gloria when we played together. I really liked her very much. My violin playing was continuing, of course. I was learning and growing quite a bit on the violin. I had a teacher that was in New Orleans at that time named Harvey Olin. It was an escape for me from the awful days in school. I really started believing what Dad said, that I would be a great violinist, and when I, quote, made it, unquote, I would be happy. It was the only thing I had hoped for. The music world held my salvation from the horrors of this world I lived in. One evening, as I was riding in the car with Dad. He began telling me about a very special school. He said, "Maury, there is a school where the most talented children from all over the world go to study their instruments. I think you may be good enough on the violin to go there one day. A few of the kids are only 10 or 12 years old, and they got to leave regular school and go to this school because they are so good. It's called the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I auditioned to go there once, but I wasn't good enough. If you really work hard, perhaps you can audition there and get in. If you make it and they accept you, it's free. Free tuition. Some kids get to study music all the time. You would like that because then you would be with others who are as talented as you, and you would fit in much better. Maury, if you reach 16 or 17 years of age and you don't have a solid technique on the violin by then, you can just forget it. You'll never make it. Then you would have to play in an orchestra like Mommy and I do, and you'd be miserable. But I know you could make it as a soloist. So it is very important for you to develop where you can play the big violin concertos by the time you audition. If you are really great on your instrument, you will get into Curtis because before you are out of high school. Otherwise, just forget it." I thought, what a wonderful school. It sounded like a fairy tale land. If only I was so good I could be there, people would like me and wouldn't beat me up and wouldn't make fun of me. That had a powerful influence on me as an 8-year-old. I determined right then that I wanted to go to that special school where I wouldn't be so unhappy. If only I was good enough on the violin, then I would be happy. That was the clear and ever-present message that Dad and Deanna gave to me. So the stock in my becoming a fine violinist was rising. I simply had to do it. I had to succeed musically in order to survive in life. Well, you know what? I'm going to go on. I'm going to go. I know I'm just reading today. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to. I feel like the Lord. Chapter 6. We're going to read one more chapter. Then I'll stop for today. Laying the foundation for my life. Shortly after we moved to Baton Rouge, my parents began looking for a violin teacher for me. They wanted someone who could challenge me and teach me correctly while being gentle and compassionate at the same time. They found an older graduate student studying for his doctorate at LSU. His name was Harvey Olin. He was very nice to me and saw right away that I had great potential on the violin. He took a very loving interest in me right from the first. I liked him very much. I was so happy to get away from having to work every day with Dad the way I had had all the previous summer in Cedar Rapids. It was such a relief to finally have a teacher outside the home again. I was truly nourished by his love for music in general, his love for me and my talent in particular, and his tremendous devotion to violin pedagogy. He treated me like a priceless Fabergé egg most of the time. He felt that I was so fragile I could break if he didn't teach me correctly. Please understand, I never thought I was good enough on the violin. No matter how good I played, it wasn't good enough for Dad. There was always the next plateau to reach. I never seemed to, quote, arrive very long before embarking on the next violinistic challenge. I felt like a failure on the instrument and as a person. But for Harvey, I was a dream come true. He really enjoyed teaching me. I looked forward to my lessons because he was very encouraging to me. He was a methodical teacher who taught me to practice patiently until I mastered something. I had never known a more dedicated teacher of the violin. During my lessons, I was always aware of his great friendship and respect. I knew that he loved me very much. In fact, he, and especially his wife Esther, touched my life spiritually in a profound way, then and also in the years ahead. They were strong evangelical Christians. They had met at Wheaton College, and they loved the Lord. They probably are responsible. Certainly, they did pray for me into my salvation and an awesome conversion that occurred several years later. Of course, Nanny Beulah. I always want to give her credit. I had forgotten about her that had prayed for me. And I thank God for allowing them to impact my life from such a young age. The Lord sent Harvey Olin to be my teacher at a time when I needed someone just like him. I needed someone who could share Jesus' love with me in a practical way through my music, planting the seeds of the gospel that would come up later in my life and bear much fruit. My first music camp experience. One day, my parents found out that a friend from Atlanta was going to be teaching at a summer music camp in Greensboro, North Carolina. It was called Eastern Music Festival. Dad thought it would be a good experience for me to attend this music camp the following summer. I was very excited at the thought of being big enough to leave home and be away from my parents for a whole summer. It was a 6-week program starting about at the end of June. This was 1972. So I had turned 9 when I went there, I think. Yeah. Starting at the end of June and going into August. I was very vocal about my desire to attend, and with Dad's high ambition for me, it wasn't too difficult to convince my parents that this was indeed a fine opportunity. However, looking back, it is shocking to realize that they allowed me to be away from home for an entire summer when I just turned 9 years old. They let me live almost entirely unsupervised in a college dormitory with a bunch of high school and college kids at the end of the drug and hippie era. I applied for and was accepted at EMF, Eastern Music Festival, for the summer of 1972. I turned 9 years old in June, and we drove up to North Carolina about a week and a half later. Dad and Deanna got me situated in the dorm where I was to room with a clarinet student. They introduced me to their friend, Derry Drinkall, who was going to be my violin teacher. They showed me where the bathroom, the cafeteria, and the concert hall were, and then they said, "Goodbye, see you at the end of the summer." Dad wrote to me once a week on his law firm letterhead. He dictated his letters and had his secretary type them. That was the primary way Dad communicated with me from then on. Sometimes his letters contained a check. If there was one, it was usually small enough to keep me in financial anxiety, but I did read his letters faithfully when they came. He tried his best to communicate his love from a distance after banishing me from his life and into the world he thought was best for me. Somehow, I survived that summer. The kids I lived with at EMF thought of me as the little kid who got into trouble without even trying. I was simply too young to be in that type of situation alone, but I could adapt easily to new things. So I managed to make it through the summer. At least the kids didn't make fun of me like the kids did in school. And they were, quite a bit older, 10 years older than me, most of them. To this day, I have always connected with that people about 10 years older than me. It's been ever since this time. I don't even know why. It's just it's always been that way. Even in ministry, I've always connected with that generation more than the newer one. As you know, if you've been listening to me teach. Actually, most of the students put up with me because they realized I was far too young to be there. Most of them they would babysit me, they would help me, they'd farm me, they'd just watch out for me. Ironically, I left EMF thinking the music world, quote unquote, was a much nicer place than, quote, the real world, unquote. I had to return that fall when I went back home to Baton Rouge. I concluded that if this was the music world of which my father spoke, I was indeed much happier in it and could fit in far better among musicians than anywhere else. He was right. I played so much in the lowest student orchestra there at EMF that I began to develop some bad habits. I developed some stiffness in my right arm and was raising my shoulder too high for my bow arm to be positioned properly. When I returned to Baton Rouge, Dad immediately noticed this and was alarmed. He and Harvey Olin began working with me to help me get over it. My parents were sure that I hadn't practiced as I should have. They were also concerned about the profanity that sometimes came out of my mouth without my realizing it. For humanists who didn't believe in God, they quickly became moral when I didn't speak right. They thought swearing was vulgar and beneath both them and me, which is true. They decided that I would not go back to the festival unless circumstances were a whole lot different. They blamed the EMF administration for their lack of care for me. But I hung out with a bunch of, hippies, basically. Or whatever. The music students and most of them used profanity. So I just did the same thing. When school started in the fall, I was assigned to Mrs. Nolan's 4th grade class. I really liked her. I sat in the front across from her desk. She was the nicest teacher I had ever had in school. I liked Mrs. Nolan because she had something very special about her. I now know it was her spirit. She knew Jesus. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but there was a special love in her heart that was apparent in the way she looked or smiled at me. I knew that she really liked me, and I did my best to really do well in my studies for her. One day, a couple of men came to our class and talked about the Bible. They said they were Gideons and would give each of us a free copy of the New Testament if we would like to have one. They loved the Bible and wanted to give it to as many people as possible. I thought they were rather boring at first, but I found myself raising my hand when they offered their Bibles. I remember taking that Bible home and reading some of it. It was a pocket-sized King James version of the New Testament. It had a small, bright, red plastic cover and very hard-to-read small print. It's just a tiny Bible. I kept it by my bed, though, and started to read some of it. I read from the book of Revelation, and it scared me. I somehow knew that this was no ordinary book. So I asked Dad about it. He said I shouldn't believe the stories in the Bible because they were made up by people and were not true. We never went to church anymore, even to the Unitarian one. We just stayed at home on Sundays. A few weeks later, Dad decided that I should go to a service at a Jewish synagogue because I was asking about God again. It was a Jewish New Year's service. Actually, no, it wasn't. It was Simchas Torah. That's what it was. It was in the fall, and my dad took me out of school. I'll never forget. Dad told me that Judaism was my heritage, and he said if I was going to believe in religion or God, the synagogue was the place to find out about him. It was a strange service, I thought, with the rabbi dancing around with the Torah scrolls and everybody following and singing in a strange language. They did give out candy, and I liked that. The rest of the service was boring. The rabbi didn't even talk in English most of the time. And when he did, he mumbled so much I couldn't understand him anyway. Dad told me he thought I was old enough to go to this special service, especially since I was asking about God. He wasn't about to let some, quote, fanatics, unquote, who came into the public schools to convert me. He had also arranged for the rabbi to meet with me to discuss God. The rabbi gave me a book of prayers and told me to remember that I am Jewish, which meant almost nothing to me. Then he said, if I wanted to know God, I must learn that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That was the only Jewish service Dad ever took me to. Now I had 2 religious books on my shelf. My little Gideon's Bible, which I knew Dad didn't approve of, and this Jewish prayer book that no one ever explained to me. The prayer book made absolutely no sense when I tried to read it. Every once in a while, I would take the little Bible down and try to read it as well, also without success. It was written in old Elizabethan English, which I couldn't understand even if I could decipher the tiny print. A visit with my mother. The school year ended, and we decided that summer music camp was not the way to go for me that year. The summer of 1973 was the only summer I did not attend a music school or camp until I was 19 years old. That year, Audrey, my real mom, invited me to come and visit her for my birthday. At that time, she was living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with her husband, Art Hilly, and her young son, Louis. So I flew out to visit her for a couple of weeks in June, and she was very happy to see me. Audrey and Art Hilly were anxious that my stay with them be as trouble-free as possible, but because of our tumultuous past, there was simply too much emotional baggage attached to every conversation and interaction with my mother. It was like living with nitroglycerin. If you shook her too hard, it would explode. She meant well, but I was increasingly more uncomfortable with each passing day. She'd just break down, start crying, and she'd overcome with guilt and, say, and no matter what I said, I felt Audrey construed it as some kind of insult toward her. If I started to talk about anything concerning Dad or my home life in Baton Rouge, she would walk out of the room or start crying and say that I hated her. She said that Dad and Deanna had put all kinds of lies in my head concerning her, and that I would never be her son in the way she wished. She felt so bad about leaving me as a baby. She said it over and over. She said that she had to because Dad was so mean to her and forced her to leave. Then she would start to cry again and look at me with her big brown eyes filled with pathetic tears and tell me that she loved me. I truly did feel compassion for her. But at the same time, I felt smothered. I tried as much as a 10-year-old can to get along with Audrey, but it wasn't working out well. So, because of that, we decided I would return to Baton Rouge earlier than we had planned. After my trip, I was happy to get back home. However, Deanna and Dad weren't getting along too well. There were more and more arguments and the resulting slammed doors and the screaming. Deanna wasn't happy in Baton Rouge, and she again began to accuse Dad of taking her away from Atlanta and her career. She kept a record of wrongs done to her and would read the long list to Dad several times a week in her head, I never fully agreed with Deanna. I was just confused about her. I had made a commitment that Dad was right about life, and especially about the music world. After the EMF summer the year before, the music world seemed to me my salvation and my only ticket out of this crazy, confusing, and painful world of my childhood. Nevertheless, I hated the occasional lessons Dad still inflicted upon me. Even worse were the comments, if I missed a note, was practicing too fast, or played a passage out of tune. Occasionally I got so angry I kicked the walls in frustration and cursed. I wanted to run away and somehow get out of my home. I didn't want to live there anymore, but there was nowhere for me to go. I also didn't want to keep playing the violin, but I knew it was my ticket out of that house, and if I was good enough, it was all I believed I could do. If I quit, I thought my parents would be terribly upset with me and tell me I'd wasted my life and thrown away this great gift that they never had. I was afraid I would be banished from their affection and would never receive anything but everlasting contempt and shame from them. So I was stuck. I had to play the violin, so I endured for the next few years as best I could. I loved it and I hated it. The consequences for quitting were simply too devastating to even consider doing so. The fall of 1973 came, and I had to return to school. I actually stayed in one school for 3 entire years. That was the last time I would do so before college. We have a few more minutes. Let's see if I have. Yeah, I just have a couple more pages. Scheming my way out of practicing. Deanna had to pick up Gloria from school each afternoon and run errands, so she was usually gone by the time I got home from the bus stop. Most of the time, I would go to the kitchen and get some kind of snack for myself out of the refrigerator. I was then supposed to practice for at least 2 hours. However, I liked watching Star Trek, which came on at 6 o'clock, and before it aired, there was Gilligan's Island, The Partridge Family, and starting with the Brady Bunch. Now, our TV was in the den next to the stairs. I was supposed to be practicing in my room, which was upstairs, opposite the stairs. Usually I went into the den, turned on the TV, and watched my shows. Sometimes Deanna would be out until close to 6 o'clock, but most of the time she returned between 4 and 5 o'clock. Of course, as soon as she entered the kitchen, she would be listening for my violin. That was because of Dad's big question when he asked every day after work, how much did Maury practice today? I devised a scheme that allowed me to watch TV, turn it off, run up the stairs and across the house to my room, pick up my violin and start practicing before Deanna entered the back door. Most of the time I successfully made it. For those times when I didn't hear the car entering the garage, I would jump up off the sofa in the den, punch the TV knob off, dash up the stairs and into the upstairs bathroom and flush the toilet. I could make it to the bathroom at the top of the stairs in time, even without hearing anything more than her hand on the door latch. That way, she only thought I was going to the bathroom, and that gave me time to get to my room where I was practicing before she came in. I think I saw a whole lot of episodes of the Brady Bunch only halfway through. I did practice diligently in spite of this. Even with my dishonest scheme, I still had to practice whenever my parents were home. Sometimes when I got to playing, I liked it, and that made it easier. But most of the time, it was hour after hour of drudgery as I practiced my scales and Kreutzer etudes and whatever piece I was working on for Dr. Olwood. I spent my entire 6th grade year working on Introduction and Rondo Capriccioso by Saint-Saëns. It was it was, at least the way I thought, it was way above my level, both technically and musically, but he insisted that I play it. So I worked and worked on this piece. Finally, after nearly 9 months of practice and with Dad's coaching, I was ready to play it for what I felt was a big competition in New Orleans. It was the Young Artist Competition for the New Orleans Philharmonic. I played for it and I won. That gave me a chance to play it with the orchestra for one of their children's concerts. I wanted to please Dad, and in order to do that, I felt I had to play at a certain level before, quote, it was too late, unquote. He played recordings for me of great violinists, such as David Oistrakh, Jascha Heifetz, and Isaac Stern. He told me that this was how I had to play. He said that the greats on the violin could all play anything by the time they were 15. If I didn't practice now, he said, and gain the kind of technique they had, I could just forget a solo career. That was Dad's great dream for me, a solo concert career. When he spoke of it, his eyes would light up, and he would describe what a wonderful life it was to travel all over the world, playing concerts, making lots of money, and having everyone falling over you wherever you went because you played so beautifully. Then he would look at me very sternly and say, You have everything it takes to make it. I could never play the way you can. You have a shot at a major concert career. But if you don't practice, you can just forget it. If you have to settle for playing in an orchestra, it's worse than anything else. I know. I've been with them. I've seen those fiddle players in orchestras. They're miserable. They feel like slaves, like Ben-Hur chained to the galleys and pulling the oars for some stupid, idiotic conductor's musical interpretation. But you have a chance to be even greater than the violin soloist playing today. If only you would turn your brain on and go for it instead of playing so half-heartedly. Of course, I had heard the same litany from Dad for years. It was nothing new. I never really wanted to play the violin when I got away from Dad and was alone, but when I was with him and under the spell of his proclamations concerning my musical destiny, I was swayed into thinking and dreaming with him. I got to where I really believed his words, as any 11-year-old would. Back to EMF. In the spring of 1974, Dad and Deanna were talking about Eastern Music Festival once again. Deanna wanted to do some real orchestra playing again. There was a faculty orchestra that met there for the summer each year, and she was interested in playing the violin in it. We encountered some resistance from the administration as to whether or not I should be admitted again as the youngest student. I was still only 11 years old, after their experience with me 2 years before. But they finally agreed to accept me on the condition that Deanna would be there to supervise and chaperone me. So Deanna, Gloria, and I drove up to North Carolina in late June of 1974. I'll never forget the banana yellow Pontiac Grand Am that got about 5 miles in the gallon and had that 8-track in it. I was very happy to be there again, but it was kind of strange having my mom just across the lawn in the faculty dormitory. I practiced very little that summer, in fact, almost none, but I had a blast. I realized that the music world was truly where I fit in. I loved being there, even though I wasn't really ready for it. God somehow preserved me through a lot of difficult and trying experiences. I had a bubbly, unsinkable enthusiasm that seemed to carry me through anything. I was so optimistic about life and music that nothing seemed to bother me. Criticism and misunderstanding just rolled off me like water off a duck's back, as long as I had a few friends who would comfort me when I felt bad. Yes, life seemed to be good, and the world was a sunny place for me at EMF. I was living in that particular fantasy that Dad had painted for me of a wonderful and glamorous music world where I could live happily ever after. That would be my pretend world for many years to come. From my summers at Eastern Music Festival and from my early life with my parents came the foundation for my perceptions of life, music, and my place in both. By the time I was 11 years old, they were solidly in place in my inner consciousness. They were built so strongly by my father's words of his faith spoken over me, thank God for the good in that, and reinforced through my experiences at home and at EMF, that they lasted all the way into my early adult life. It is remarkable how powerful and strong the perceptions had been built into me by my father. Life was a wonderful, scary, unpredictable, and awesome experience for me. Okay, so it's 7 o'clock now, so I ended up reading a long time. But I hope you get something out of it. You can understand me better, you know. Thank you for joining me today. This is a little different. Tomorrow we'll receive communion and everything. This is more of a reading day, and we're going to also, I want to read from the New Kind of Love, but probably we'll go into Romans tomorrow, so I'll teach the Bible and flow in that. But, you know, the reason I'm reading my testimony is the Bible says we overcome by the word of our testimony. And this this is a very special book because it not only, you know, I know it seems a little like, why are you talking so much about yourself? Except you have it. This is the foundation of who I am and how Jesus, what he did for me and how extraordinary it was. And so anyway, I want to bless you tonight. Hallelujah. And hallelujah. I'm going to. Now may the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you his shalom, peace. And may the grace of our Lord, Yeshua the Messiah, Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be yours. Be blessed tonight. Thank you, dear ones, for listening. And we'll should be back at 6 tomorrow, Lord willing, and at Pacific time. And this was a reading night. I hope that was okay with you. And you know what? I should have said hello to you. I didn't tonight. I guess I didn't do all the things I was supposed to. But I will. I love you all. And y'all have a wonderful evening. Thanks for listening. Shalom. Good night.